You ever wake up to find your backyard has been invaded by someone else's underwear? No, not a raccoon dragging away a sock. An entire load of pastel bras and granny panties fluttering from your 6-foot cedar fence like some kind of deranged, suburban prayer flag. That was my Tuesday. And honestly, if you'd told me last year that my biggest nemesis would be a 40-something woman named Karen from next door, complete with aggressively blonde hair and an arsenal of complaints about leaf blowers and Halloween decorations, I would have laughed. But there I was, still in my robe, coffee mug dangling from my hand, staring at a parade of damp clothing flapping in the early morning breeze. Karen had struck again, and this time she'd brought reinforcements: her laundry. The absurdity hit me before the anger did. I could almost see Karen in my mind's eye, arms folded, lips pursed in concentration, positioning each article of clothing with the precision of a flag at half-mast. This was not an accident. Last week it was her dog digging holes along the fence line, the week before that her nephew using my driveway as a skate park. Now it was her laundry, strung neatly between the upright slats, as if my property line was an extension of her utility room. My fence, which I'd paid for and stained myself, was now host to an entire wardrobe of flower-printed regret. I wish I could say I handled it calmly right away, but let's be honest. The sight of your neighbor's size XXL bloomers airing out just a foot from your grilling spot can trigger all sorts of primal feelings. I snapped a picture, considered sending it to the HOA, then realized Karen was the HOA president. Of course she was. She'd won the position in a coup so dramatic it might have made Napoleon blush. No surprise that the neighborhood newsletter, suspiciously edited by her husband, featured an article just last month on the benefits of neighborly cooperation. My fence, apparently, was the latest victim of her benevolence. I could have gone nuclear. I could have yanked the laundry off the fence, marched over, and dumped it on her doorstep with a sarcastic note. Instead, I walked the length of the fence, sipping my coffee, cataloging the garments, and thinking. There's a certain power in not reacting. Karen lived for drama, for scenes on the sidewalk, for neighbors crowding around to hear her recount some minor infraction. I wouldn't give her that. But I wasn't about to let this go, either. I spent the day working from home, but my focus kept drifting to the fence. By mid-afternoon, Karen herself appeared, right on schedule, wearing her usual pastel tracksuit and flip-flops. She was humming, a little too loudly, as she retrieved her sun-dried clothes. Our eyes met through a gap in the boards. She waved, all fake cheer, and shouted thanks for the generous use of my fence. She did not ask permission, just like she'd never asked to let her kids cut through my yard or to dump her fall leaves on my side. If you've never lived next to a Karen, you might think this was the point where I set boundaries. You'd be wrong. Setting boundaries with someone like her is like drawing a line in sand during a windstorm. She'd see it, ignore it, and then claim she couldn't see it at all. So I waited. I let her think she'd won. I watched as, the next day, she hung another load of laundry, this time even more flamboyant. Bed sheets, towels, a couple of suspiciously stained pillowcases. She even added a ribbon, as if decorating for the world's saddest party. I saw a few neighbors strolling by, pausing to take in the spectacle. Karen was on her patio, sipping wine and chatting on the phone, basking in her own audacity. That's when I started researching wind tunnels. Not the kind you find in laboratories or car commercials, but the sort you could build in a backyard with a little know-how and some strategic use of power tools. I'm not an engineer by trade, but I am very good at two things: holding a grudge and making elaborate plans. The fence was sturdy, but I knew from the way the wind howled through the alley on certain afternoons that a little bit of science could go a long way. If Karen wanted to use my fence as a clothesline, then her laundry was going to have to survive the gale force of my pettiness. I ordered supplies. Industrial fans, plywood, a set of cheap anemometers from an online auction. When the boxes arrived, Karen watched me from her kitchen window, suspicion written all over her face. I waved cheerfully. She didn't wave back. Over the weekend, I built the frame in my garage. On Monday, after she'd gone to work, I started assembling it along the fence line. 10 feet high, reinforced with brackets, the tunnel pointed straight at the patch of fence where her laundry always hung. I installed 3 massive fans at the base, all on timers, all pointing upward at a slight angle. The neighbors walked by, slowing down to watch, whispering to each other. Karen, finally, couldn't resist. She cornered me by the mailbox that evening, her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she might snap in half. "What are you building?" she demanded. "Just a little home improvement project," I replied, with the kind of calm that makes people nervous. She asked if I had a permit. I asked if she had a permit for her laundry line. She bristled, but she couldn't argue. She stormed away, but the next morning her laundry was back, bolder than ever. The day I fired up the wind tunnel, the sky was perfectly clear. Karen's laundry danced on the fence, unbothered by the gentle morning breeze. I waited until she left for her book club. Then I hit the switch. The fans roared to life, and a wall of wind tore down the tunnel, hitting the fence with enough force to send socks, towels, and pajamas flying into the next yard. Shirts caught the wind like sails and sailed over rooftop. I could hear the distant barking of a dog, the shriek of a car alarm, the confused shouts of a neighbor 2 houses down who had just been smacked in the face by a polka-dot bra. By the time Karen returned, the fence was bare. Her laundry was scattered all over the block, tangled in trees and gutters, some of it probably halfway to the next county. She stood there, gaping, trying to process what had happened. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, the very picture of innocence. She opened her mouth to yell, but no words came out. For the first time in as long as I could remember, Karen was speechless. And as I sipped my coffee, watching her scramble after her runaway wardrobe, I couldn't help but think, this was only the beginning. The morning after the great laundry launch, the neighborhood was buzzing. I stepped out to retrieve my newspaper and saw 2 pillowcases tangled high in Mr. Lieberman's crabapple tree, a pair of yoga pants splayed across the windshield of a neighbor's minivan, and one of Karen's bras, giant, padded, floral, draped with perfect symmetry over a garden gnome 3 houses down. I tried not to smile, but failed. For once, the usual morning patrol of dog walkers and joggers weren't exchanging wary glances about my lawn length or Karen's latest campaign for mailbox uniformity. They were talking about laundry. Specifically, Karen's laundry, and how it had defied gravity. The spectacle had clearly brightened the week for a few folks who'd suffered in silence through Karen's reign of clipboard terror. But if there was one thing I'd learned about Karen, it was this. Nothing, and I mean nothing, would keep her down for long. By 10, I spotted her stalking the block with a trash bag, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, plucking garments off fences, hedges, and even the side mirror of a Prius. Her mouth was pinched, her cheeks flushed. She wasn't alone. Her best friend, Judy, a woman with a perpetual scowl and a matching love for passive-aggressive next-door posts, was helping her. Every time they spotted a lost sock, they'd shoot a glare at my house, like I was the one who'd started a cyclone. I pretended not to notice, opting for extra yard work that day. I weeded flower beds, cleaned gutters, replaced a warped fence board, all within perfect view of Karen's recovery operation. She didn't say a word. Judy, though, made a point of dropping hints as she passed. "Some people just don't understand community," she called out, too loudly, as she stuffed a sopping t-shirt into Karen's bag. "A shame, really." Karen, lips drawn into a tight line, nodded in furious agreement. It was obvious the wind tunnel incident hadn't gone down as they'd hoped. Karen's usual approach was to escalate until her opponent backed off in embarrassment or exhaustion. But now the embarrassment was hers, public and spectacular. It was a small victory, and I savored it. That afternoon, a formal-looking email arrived in my inbox. Subject line: Request for immediate cessation of hazardous activity. The sender? HOA President Karen Marshall. It was 3 paragraphs of legalese threatening remedial action, if I didn't dismantle the wind tunnel contraption immediately. Apparently, my outdoor air disturbance device constituted a violation of Section 4.2.7 of the HOA regulations, conveniently rewritten last month, no doubt in anticipation of some crime against neighborhood peace. I scrolled to the end and found a warning that if the device wasn't gone by Friday, she'd be forced to initiate a formal complaint with municipal authorities. I could practically hear the gavel banging in her mind. Of course, what Karen didn't know was that I'd done my homework. The new wind tunnel wasn't technically a permanent structure. It was mobile, didn't obstruct any walkways, and produced less noise than the average leaf blower. I'd even run the plans past a city inspector, an old college friend, who had laughed so hard over the phone that he almost dropped his sandwich, then reassured me it didn't violate a single ordinance. But this wasn't about city codes for Karen. It was about control. I replied politely, promising to turn off the fans until we could mutually resolve the matter in the spirit of neighborhood harmony. I copied the full HOA board, which I knew annoyed her. The rest of the board was mostly indifferent, except for Tom from 2 doors down, who always voted with whoever brought donuts to the meetings. That night, as the sun dipped behind the oaks, Karen paced the edge of her yard, muttering to Judy. I could see them both glaring over the fence, plotting. The next morning, the wind tunnel stood silent. But Karen, in true form, had doubled down. When I looked out, she'd strung a new, even longer line of laundry, not on my fence this time, but on a set of collapsible racks arranged directly up against the property line. The racks were practically an architectural feat, 4 levels high, clothing billowing like ship sails. Not only that, but she'd set up a series of little lawn signs in cursive font. Laundry in progress, please respect our community's cleanliness, and airing out for a healthier neighborhood. It was so over the top that even Judy looked embarrassed, and that was saying something. Worse, Karen had recruited her family. Her husband, a soft-spoken accountant with the look of a man who had long ago accepted defeat, lugged out yet more racks. Her teenaged son, mortified, tried to shield his face as he hung socks in neat rows. Soon the entire fence line, my view of the street, and even part of my driveway was obscured by layer after layer of drying clothes. The scent of fabric softener was so thick I could taste it. People slowed their cars to stare. One neighbor took pictures, maybe for evidence, maybe just for laughs. I tried to keep my cool. After all, wasn't escalation Karen's greatest weapon? But as the hours passed and the shadow of her laundry fortress crept farther into my yard, I started to feel cornered. I considered hauling out the wind tunnel again, but she'd anticipated that. The racks were anchored down with sandbags, and the new laundry signs cited HOA policy about respecting neighbors' property during weather-related incidents. She'd turned her own humiliation into a statement of principle. It was impressively audacious, even for her. That evening, the HOA group chat exploded. Karen sent photos of my wind tunnel, accusing me of unneighborly conduct and warning that my dangerous experiment had almost cost her several $100s in lost garments. I responded with photos of her racks blocking my access to the street. Other neighbors chimed in, most of them just enjoying the show, but a few hinting that maybe, just maybe, Karen was going too far this time. Tom the donut voter posted a picture of his own clothesline, 50 feet from his house, nowhere near anyone else's yard. Seems like this is getting out of hand, he wrote. Anyone else miss the days when we fought about mailbox paint? By the next morning, things took a new turn. I woke to the sound of hammering and peered outside to see Karen and Judy at work. They were erecting an actual, literal privacy screen, 6 feet tall, decorated with fake ivy and motivational slogans in sparkly paint. Good fences make good neighbors, read one. Another simply said, positive vibes only. The screen completely blocked my view, turned my backyard into a shady alcove, and, I suspected, violated at least 3 of Karen's own precious HOA rules. But there it was, the physical embodiment of a standoff, stretching the full length of our adjoining yard. But even this wasn't the worst part. As the sun climbed higher, I saw her setting up a folding table near the screen. On it, she placed a massive binder, stacks of notepads, and several thermoses of coffee. She'd scheduled an emergency HOA meeting on my property line. She invited every board member, even posted flyers on neighborhood mailboxes. Her mission, it seemed, was to turn my home into a battleground for her own personal version of suburban justice. I watched as cars arrived, people emerged with clipboards and skepticism, and Karen, flanked by Judy, prepared to make her grand case. The first sign that this HOA meeting would be unlike any other was the parking. By the time I finished my morning coffee, my usually quiet street had turned into something between a used car lot and a neighborhood block party, if block parties were filled with tense faces and folding chairs instead of laughter. SUVs and sedans lined the curb, leaving only a narrow passage for anyone brave enough to drive through. At precisely 10:01, Karen, wearing a new pastel blazer and pearls big enough to be classified as flotation devices, made her entrance at the head of a small parade. Judy, of course, trailed close behind, arms laden with snack trays and the infamous binder. Tom the donut voter was easy to spot, already eating from a pink bakery box. It wasn't just board members. A handful of curious neighbors, some clutching mugs, others with kids on scooters, gathered behind the privacy screen, eager for the show. Karen tapped her watch, scowled theatrically at me through the fake ivy, and announced that, given the severity of recent events, today's agenda would focus exclusively on outdoor decorum, boundary etiquette, and neighborhood wellness initiatives. I could practically hear the capital letters in her voice. I dressed for the occasion. Flannel shirt, work jeans, an air of calm so complete it bordered on smug. Karen tried to corral the crowd's attention, but the mood was not as obedient as she hoped. More than a few neighbors, likely motivated by equal parts curiosity and schadenfreude, glanced back and forth between us. One dad, pushing a stroller, whispered to his wife, "I heard her underwear ended up on Elm Street." His wife shushed him, eyes sparkling with mischief. Karen launched into her opening speech, invoking the sacred trust of property lines and the foundational importance of mutual respect in the subdivision. She recited bylaws and threatened citations for reckless wind use, which drew a snort from Tom, who tried to disguise it as a cough. Then, clutching her binder like a holy relic, she presented the evidence. Printouts of photos, several obviously taken from my own backyard. In the center, enlarged to the point of absurdity, was a shot of her laundry mid-flight, my wind tunnel's undeniable handiwork. She described her losses with theatrical gravity. "This is not only about property damage," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound practiced. "It's about community standards. If we allow one person to build a wind machine, what comes next? Yard cannons? Motorized scarecrows? Where does it end?" Judy nodded along, face puckered in righteous indignation. I waited until the last possible moment to respond, letting the tension peak. Then I rose, thanked everyone for coming, and calmly laid out my defense. First, I pointed out that my wind tunnel was mobile, not permanent, and didn't break any city ordinances. I held up a copy of an email from the inspector for all to see. Second, I continued, the wind tunnel only became necessary after repeated violations of my property. I have dozens of photos of laundry draped on my fence, week after week, despite polite requests to respect the boundary. Judy tried to interject, but I cut her off, politely but firmly. "I'm not against clean laundry," I said. "But I do expect the right to enjoy my property without being conscripted into my neighbor's wash cycle. If we're talking community, maybe that conversation goes both ways." There were nods from a few neighbors. I caught Tom's eye and he gave me a thumbs up, powdered sugar dotting his beard. Karen, flustered but unwilling to cede ground, pivoted hard. She claimed I'd endangered public safety. "My son's hoodie landed in the street," she said, voice rising. "It could have caused an accident." The hoodie in question was about as dangerous as a paper bag, but the point was made. She called for a vote to ban all mechanical wind devices within 50 feet of any shared fence. She glared at the other board members, daring them to oppose her. But her grandstanding backfired. Tom reminded the board that Karen herself had campaigned last year to allow free expression in backyard decor, after she'd tried to install an enormous metal flamingo and lost. A neighbor in the back pointed out that, if we really wanted to talk hazards, Karen's mountain of laundry racks was blocking a sidewalk used by kids every morning. Someone else suggested the real solution was simply respecting property lines, period. Suddenly, the tide was turning. The meeting dissolved into smaller debates, punctuated by laughter and side conversations. Karen's grip on the crowd slipped. I took the opportunity to pass around a stack of HOA bylaw copies with my own notes, highlighting the lack of any rule against wind tunnels. For every point Karen made, I had a counterpoint. Her binder of evidence began to look like the world's worst family scrapbook. The temperature was rising, both figuratively and literally. As the sun climbed, the privacy screen became less of a shield and more of a sauna. People drifted into my yard, seeking shade beneath my maple tree. The real twist came when the city inspector, my old friend, showed up, clipboard in hand, grinning at the spectacle. He took a brief walk around the wind tunnel, checked off a few boxes, and declared to the crowd, "No code violations here. Looks like you folks just need a good mediator." His words landed like a water balloon at a formal dinner. Karen's face was a mix of rage and disbelief. She sputtered about community, but most people were no longer listening. Tom started a conversation about next year's block party. Judy glared at everyone, especially me. Karen tried one more time to salvage control, proposing a new rule about unsightly machinery. The board, for once, was ambivalent. Then came the real kicker. While Karen was distracted arguing with the inspector, her son, maybe tired of the drama, maybe just hungry, knocked over one of the massive laundry racks. Like dominoes, the racks tipped, sending wet towels and bedsheets tumbling across both yards, right in the middle of the assembled crowd. Karen shrieked and tried to save what she could, but the wind picked up at just the wrong moment, sending a swirl of towels over the privacy screen and into the neighbors' yards. The crowd burst out laughing. For a brief second, Karen looked small, not in stature but in power. Her facade crumpled as quickly as the laundry fortress. Neighbors, emboldened by the chaos, started chatting about their own grievances. The parking tickets, the aggressive newsletters, the endless rules about grass height and mailbox color. The HOA meeting, meant to be her stage, was quickly becoming a referendum on her entire regime. I stayed calm, letting the moment stretch. I hadn't engineered the collapse, but it was poetic justice. Karen muttered to Judy, then, clearly defeated for the day, started to gather up the mess. The crowd began to disperse, many smiling at me, a few patting me on the back. The inspector gave me a conspiratorial wink before heading out. The wind tunnel, still standing silent, looked almost regal in the chaos. As the sun set, the only thing left of the meeting was the privacy screen, now adorned with a bedsheet sporting a cartoon duck, fluttering like a flag of surrender. I retreated inside, exhausted but satisfied. The neighborhood had seen what happened when you pushed too hard. But knowing Karen, I doubted this was her final move. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. And neither was I. 3 days passed without a single sock, towel, or passive-aggressive lawn sign appearing anywhere near my fence. For the first time in months, my yard felt like my own. I spent those mornings savoring the quiet. Coffee on the porch, the faint hum of sprinklers, birds picking at the seed I'd scattered by the garden beds. The wind tunnel sat dormant but ready, an absurd monument to one man's refusal to be conscripted into laundry service. It was peaceful, sure, but anyone who's ever dealt with a Karen knows that a calm front is almost always just the eye of the storm. By the 4th day, the peace broke in a way that was so on brand for Karen that I nearly applauded. It started with the sound of an engine and the flash of an orange vest. I looked out to see a crew of 3 men, all wearing matching company shirts emblazoned with Marshall Family Home Services. Karen herself stood in my driveway, clipboard in hand, issuing instructions as if orchestrating the opening ceremony of the Suburban Olympic. She'd brought in her own family business, her brother's landscaping company, notorious for mowing lawns at ear-splitting decibels on Sunday mornings and spraying weed killer with all the precision of a toddler with a squirt gun. I stepped out, keeping my expression neutral. "Morning, Karen," I called. "Big project?" She didn't look up, just waved her clipboard and declared, "We're finally going to get rid of this neighborhood eyesore." It took me a second to realize she was pointing at the wind tunnel, not her fortress of laundry racks, but my invention. Her crew was already measuring and snapping photos, probably for the HOA's records. She didn't bother explaining. Karen's favorite brand of authority was the kind that didn't need to justify itself. This was a fresh angle. Karen wasn't fighting me directly anymore. She was trying to overwhelm me with bureaucracy, paperwork, and if all else failed, heavy machinery. Her brother, Doug, a man built like a bulldozer with the subtlety to match, wandered over. "You want us to haul this contraption away now, or you got a court order for us?" he asked, not unkindly. I shrugged. "I'd love to see the paperwork," I said. He grinned, glanced at Karen, and muttered, "Didn't think so." He moved off to join his crew. For the next hour, the landscape crew paraded up and down my property line, documenting every square inch. Karen hovered, alternating between giving instructions and snapping photos of her own. I kept my cool, but I could feel the gears in my head start to turn. Clearly, she'd found some obscure clause in the HOA regulations about unapproved structures, and was planning to force a hearing, maybe even escalate to city code enforcement if she could. That evening, my suspicions were confirmed. I received a certified letter from the HOA board, convened in emergency session by Karen, announcing a formal complaint regarding hazardous, unsightly, and unapproved mechanical devices. I had 2 days to remove the wind tunnel or face a hefty fine and potential legal action. Attached was a packet of evidence. Grainy photos, a single neighbor's written complaint, from Judy, naturally, and copies of bylaws so old they might as well have been written in Latin. There was a hearing scheduled for Saturday morning. I was invited to defend myself, as is your right under HOA policy, the letter added, as if that was a generous concession. I spent the next day prepping for battle. I reviewed every bylaw, highlighted every contradiction, and printed off emails from city inspectors. I made a flowchart of every time Karen had used my fence for her own benefit, cross-referenced by date, time, and weather conditions. But that wasn't all. The city inspector, my friend Steve, agreed to stop by just for a casual coffee, promising to stay as an unofficial witness. I set up a camera on my porch, aimed squarely at the wind tunnel, just in case the landscaping crew got any ideas in the night. When Saturday arrived, I was ready. The board convened under a pop-up tent on Karen's lawn, a setup so formal you'd think they were presiding over the fate of a condemned building, not a wind tunnel made from plywood and fans. Karen opened the meeting with a speech that could have doubled as an ad for her own re-election, words like community, safety, and aesthetics peppered liberally throughout. Judy read her statement next, decrying the threat to harmony posed by unregulated wind speeds. Doug's crew stood by, arms folded, clearly there for muscle, not for debate. I kept my rebuttal short and precise. I explained the purpose of the wind tunnel, outlined its compliance with every code and regulation, and provided the inspector's written approval. I highlighted the many ways Karen herself had used my fence without permission, and the pattern of her escalating behavior. Tom, bless him, produced his own research, a list of wind-powered garden features he'd seen across the subdivision. "If we ban this, half the kids lose their pinwheels," he deadpanned, drawing laughter from the crowd. But Karen, undeterred, introduced her final weapon, a motion to impose a retroactive rule, No mechanical devices of any kind within 20 feet of a property line, to be enforced immediately. She looked straight at me, daring anyone to object. For a moment, the board hesitated. I could see doubt flicker on a few faces. Then Steve the inspector raised his hand. You realize, if you pass this rule, every house with a pool pump, air conditioning unit, or even a garden fountain is in violation? He asked, dead serious. A ripple ran through the group. Even Doug looked worried. Judy scrambled to clarify, but it was too late. The meeting devolved into a heated debate, with half the crowd worried about fines for their own homes. Suddenly, Karen's push for total control was backfiring. Neighbors began speaking up, not just about my wind tunnel, but about years of petty enforcement, lopsided rules, and HOA overreach. One neighbor recounted how Karen had tried to cite him for having an unauthorized garden gnome. Another told the group about Judy's campaign against unfestive Christmas lights. The grievances spilled out, more and more voices joining until it sounded less like a hearing and more like a revolt. Karen's composure finally cracked. Her voice trembled as she insisted the rule was for everyone's good, but nobody was listening. Tom, seizing the moment, moved to table her motion until a comprehensive review could be conducted by a neutral party. The vote was almost unanimous, with only Karen and Judy opposing. Her last weapon, the retroactive ban, was dead on arrival. As the crowd dispersed, I caught Karen's eye. For the first time, I saw real uncertainty behind the practiced smile. She'd thrown everything at me. Public humiliation, bureaucracy, her family business, even the full force of the HOA, and nothing had stuck. Around us, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, the tension snapped like a worn-out clothesline. That evening, as I sat in the backyard beneath the wind tunnel, Steve handed me a cold drink and raised his glass. To standing your ground, he said. I toasted him, glancing across the fence. Karen's lawn was empty. Her privacy screen was gone, her rack stowed, her clipboard nowhere in sight. For now, the battlefield was quiet. But in the silence, I knew this suburban war was building toward its endgame. And I was more than ready for the final round. It was only a matter of time before Karen made her final move. That's how these things go, quiet on the surface, but underneath, all plotting and resentment. For the first time in years, my property line was just a fence again, no laundry or lawn signs, no makeshift privacy screens. Even the birds seemed to sense the tension had lifted, hopping in the grass where Karen's racks used to cast their shadow. But I wasn't naive. Karen hadn't disappeared. She was regrouping. The question wasn't if she'd strike back, but how. The answer came 2 weeks later, wrapped in the sort of bureaucratic trap only a true HOA Karen could devise. It arrived by certified mail, an official summons for a neighborhood cleanliness audit, issued on HOA letterhead and signed twice by Karen herself. In the letter, she announced that the entire street would undergo surprise inspections for health and aesthetic violations, with fines for offenders and repeat abusers of shared community space. She listed a series of new standards, most so vague they could apply to anything: grass too long, paint too faded, noise unpleasantly excessive. There was even a clause about unapproved garden scents. In classic Karen style, she didn't just want to win, she wanted to reassert control, making everyone as nervous and uncomfortable as she felt. By sunset, word had spread. Neighbors texted, called, and even stopped by my porch to share their outrage. Nobody liked Karen's audit. Even her usual supporters grumbled. It didn't help that her flyers, stapled to every mailbox, threatened hefty penalties and described the HOA board as the final arbiter. It felt less like neighborhood improvement and more like a power grab. The next morning, the audit began. Karen and Judy strolled from house to house, checklists in hand, phones ready to snap evidence. Doug trailed behind, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. They measured lawns with rulers, peered over hedges, even sniffed the air by backyard grills. It was theater, petty, performative, and desperate. When they finally reached my house, Karen paused theatrically, as if preparing for a grand reveal. She spent an extra minute inspecting the wind tunnel, now freshly painted and decorated with potted plants to meet every line of HOA code. Judy took photos of my garbage cans, my mailbox, even a tiny crack in my driveway that had been there since the Clinton administration. Karen clicked her pen, looking satisfied. "You'll be hearing from us," she announced, as if delivering a prophecy. That night, I received the inevitable violation notice. Yard structure out of character with community aesthetics. The penalty: a $500 fine and a 30-day deadline to remove the wind tunnel or face escalating sanctions. They'd finally done it. Written a rule so vague, so clearly targeted, that anyone with a gnome or a garden hose could be in violation. I expected anger. Instead, what I felt was something closer to amusement. Karen had thrown every tool she had at me. But now she was running out of tools. I called my old friend Steve, the city inspector, and invited him for dinner. Nothing official, just a neighborly chat. While we grilled burgers, I laid out the situation. Steve listened, then grinned. "Let's take a walk," he said. We strolled through my backyard, where he inspected every inch of the wind tunnel, taking note. Then, he did the same for half the houses on the block. When he finished, he shook his head. "This isn't a violation of anything except her pride," he said. "But you know, there's something else you could do. If you really want this to end, you need to show the neighborhood what real community looks like." That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I called Tom and a few other neighbors, inviting them for coffee and brainstorming. By the end of the hour, we had a plan, not for revenge, but for unity. We'd host the first community open yard day. No more secrets, no more hiding. Anyone could tour any willing neighbor's yard, check out gardens, talk DIY, share lemonade or stories. We'd open our fences, literally and figuratively, and show what neighborliness really meant. The HOA bylaws had nothing against gatherings or open yard events. If Karen wanted to inspect, let her, but she'd be outnumbered and, for the first time, powerless. On Saturday, people trickled onto lawns up and down the street. There were makeshift signs, hand-painted and cheerful, welcoming everyone. I set up a table of snacks next to the wind tunnel, now decorated with streamers and a giant sign that read, "Ask me about backyard airflow." Kids ran around with pinwheels. Dogs sniffed each other at the fence gates. Old Mrs. Carter set out lemonade and cupcake. The whole block came alive. The nervousness that Karen's audit had brought turned to laughter and connection. People swapped gardening tips, shared stories of past HOA battles, even helped paint over Judy's favorite no parking curb. Karen and Judy showed up, not with checklists, but with forced smiles and travel mugs. They wandered the yards, searching for violations but finding nothing but hospitality and neighbors enjoying themselves. Karen approached my table, hesitating by the wind tunnel. "Is this legal?" she asked quietly. I grinned, offering her a pinwheel. "More than legal. It's community approved," I said. For a second, Karen looked lost. Stripped of her power, her rules, her ability to intimidate. She tried one last time, cornering Tom near his flower bed, pointing out a supposedly non-compliant gnome. But Tom just laughed. "Guess you'll have to find the whole block, Karen. Or maybe just come grab a lemonade and let it go." People gathered, listening. Some rolled their eyes. Others, emboldened, chimed in about their own small violations. The purple porch, the homemade birdbath, the creative mailbox. It was a soft mutiny, polite but unmistakable. For the first time, the fear was gone. By sundown, the event felt less like an act of defiance and more like a celebration of the neighborhood Karen had tried to control. The wind tunnel remained, not just as a petty invention, but as a symbol, a monument to boundaries, resilience, and knowing when to push back. The HOA board, minus Karen and Judy, admitted over pie that maybe it was time to revise some policies. Even Doug stayed for burgers and over a beer confessed, she means well, but man, she just doesn't know when to stop. When everyone finally drifted home, I lingered by the fence, the quiet settling over everything. Karen's house was dark. I could see her in the window, talking on the phone, pacing like a general retreating from battle. She hadn't won. But neither had I, not exactly. What we'd built, messy, loud, real, wasn't victory over Karen. It was freedom from her. There would always be another rule, another audit, another petty war. But now the neighborhood knew how to stand together. Karen might always be Karen, but her power was broken. In the days that followed, I took down the wind tunnel, not in defeat but because I didn't need it anymore. I rebuilt the fence with help from Tom and the kids, fresh cedar slats standing tall. The air felt lighter, the yard wider. People still came by, sometimes just to chat, sometimes to borrow a rake. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned gold behind the new fence, I caught Karen on her porch. She gave a small, weary wave. Nothing dramatic, no grand speeches. Just a neighbor, finally acknowledging another neighbor. I raised my mug in salute. Sometimes that's all you get. And sometimes that's enough.